She came in to be treated, but her doctor saw something no one else did. The line sat in Aiden Lee's head like a small, sharp stone. It had nothing to do with headlines or heroism. It belonged to a precise, human moment. The way the bandages lay across a woman's chest, how the cotton was pulled tight enough to flatten the small rise and fall of a breath until it looked almost politely still. He saw the tape digging into pale skin, the faint bruises under the gauze, and a pattern his sleep-deprived mind refused to ignore. In the leaden light of St. Augustine's ICU, where machines kept time and staff moved with the practiced detachment of those who had learned to survive emergency after emergency, Aiden felt something pull taut in him, the responsibility that made him a doctor in the first place. Olivia Nyen had been here for 6 months. Her name was spoken with a kind of astonished distance in the staff room. Olivia Nyen, 32, tech founder, investor, public persona who had suddenly become the silhouette of someone else. The news brigade had called her brilliant and private. The hospital's private rooms were exactly that, quiet, glassed off from the corridor with a small plaque and a cleaner schedule. Machines reported in blips and hums. Family visited within the permitted hours. Nurses rotated. The administrators signed forms. Life, in the form of the monitors and the ventilator's small, steady sigh, continued. Aiden checked the chart again because that was what he did when something wouldn't let go of him. The CT scans, repeated, reviewed, didn't suggest an ongoing catastrophe that would justify such prolonged unconsciousness. Traumatic brain injury, yes, but the scans had been kind in a way that didn't fit 6 months' absence. He was young, 31, with an edema of caffeine and principle that kept him on morning rounds and late-night chart reviews. He'd come to St. Augustine because it was the place that still let him listen. He expected friction. Margaret, the head nurse, made it her work to conserve both patients and bed space. She carried the hospital's rules around her like a shield. Aiden respected her. He also noticed things. Today it was the bandages. He had been all but invisible in the room at first. 2 steps, a soft knock, the violin of the ventilator. Olivia's chest rose with small, 2 stiff breaths, the way someone braces against cold. Aiden reached out without thinking, fingers hovering over the tape as he watched for the next exhalation. The tape dug in at the edges, folding the skin in a way that suggested the dressings had been applied once and let be ever since. A knot of adhesive at the sternum. He couldn't tell whether they had been meant to support or to hide. His mind made a small, cruel calculation. Bandages that tight would muffle cough reflex, make small breaths even harder. The next step in that calculation was louder and meaner, restricting respiratory function, encouraging collapse.
It wasn't a conclusion he could accept without action. "Aiden," Margaret said from the doorway, voice low but edged. "Those are the wound dressings from the first emergency team. They're fine. Please don't disturb them." "They're past due for a change," he said. His voice had the practiced calm of someone used to asking for something he had to get. "Look at the undermining here. They could be constricting her chest wall." Margaret's mouth tightened. "The wound team approved them. Anything we do outside of protocol will get you and me in trouble." "She could be being made to stay under," Aiden heard himself say, and the words dropped, bright as a coin on tile. He knew how it sounded, conspiracy-minded, overeager. He also knew that a clinician's first duty was to the patient in the room. "If they're impairing ventilation, Margaret?" "You think someone's doing this on purpose?" she asked, the skepticism trailing off into caution. "That's serious. We have families, insurance, legal." "I think they're tight," he said. "I need to be able to examine her properly." Margaret hesitated, then gave him an index. 2 minutes, she said. Her face softened the barest fraction. She'd seen him hold the hands of dying patients in the rain outside radiology, and she had a long memory for devotion. "But if you do anything, you sign the incident log." Aiden smiled a fox of a smile and reached into the drawer for scissors. He had a pair he liked, small, sharp, a stainless thing that had been given to him by a retired ER nurse when he'd taken his residency oath. The handles fit his hand the way a familiar pen does. He slid the blades under the adhesive, feeling his skin itch with that small, rule-breaking thrill that came when the rightness of a thing outweighed the fear of consequence. He cut the tape. It was a perfectly ordinary, unremarkable act. 2 snips, peel the cotton away. For a long second it only revealed more of the same. A paler chest, a faint impression where the bandage had been, the intravenous line, the catheter, the faint bloom of bruising from months of immobility. Then the monitor, flat, steady in its monotonous cadence, breathed differently. The chest beneath the cloth, released from its bind, drew in a breath so clean and deliberate it was like a person remembering to come up out of water. The heart monitor registered the bloom within the same breath. The single clinical beep that had been constant for months sharpened to a different rhythm, an extra spike, a micro-variation that any trained ear would hear as something like surprise. Those small fluctuations mattered. Margaret's hand went to her mouth. The nurse at the bedside wiped at invisible moisture. For a second they all looked as if they'd seen a ghost. "She twitched," the nurse said, voice very small.
Aiden's pulse picked up in response, not because of the monitor, he could read beeps for a living, but because of the human calculus of the moment, the combination of gesture and response that could be read as coincidence or as the first note of something else. In the corner of the room, a deck of playing cards sat, shoved aside on the bedside table, someone's small attempt at comfort, a prop of normal life. The sight of it steadied him. He wrote one line in the incident log with a hand that didn't quite shake. Bandage replaced, respiratory effort improved. "If you log it, it happened," Margaret murmured, and the bureaucrat in her had won. Still, she didn't stop him from adjusting the dressing. She only made sure everything was noted in her own neat handwriting. That night, Aiden's apartment felt too quiet. Rain had started and thudded soft on the windows. He lay awake, thinking of the small, cheap scissors and the way tape can lie. He thought of service and of the oddness of privilege. Olivia Nyen was a name that meant doors opened, boardroom doors, charity gala chairs, the kind of money that billed clinics as PR gestures. But in the narrow confines of the ICU, privilege dissolved into the same thing that defined everyone there: fragility. The next morning did not absolve him of doubt. The monitors continued to fluctuate in ways that suggested more than the normal course of recovery, the occasional breath that came with a more deliberate rhythm, a slow tightening of a jaw as if a thought was trying to find purchase. A physical therapist ran a cautious hand on Olivia's leg. A social worker cleared forms in the hall. Margaret kept an eye on Aiden as if he were a rash decision waiting to happen. He found the vial by accident. He had been looking for a roll of gauze in a small supply room that smelled faintly of antiseptic and old coffee, the kind of place where hospitals kept the ghost things: replacement tubing, expired swabs, a box of gloves that had been misfiled. The vial lay under a stack of plain bandage boxes, tucked into the corner like a private rumor. There was no label, only a small faint mark where a sticker might once have been torn away. It was the kind of omission that could happen: supply chains, replacements. It was also the kind of omission that had consequences. He put the vial in his pocket like contraband. He knew he should hand it to the pharmacy. He also knew that a hospital's bureaucracy could bury a time-sensitive question under a week of forms. He called Jake. Jake was a lab tech who had once been a high school biology teacher and who had a soft spot for improvisation. He answered on the second ring, voice still sleepy, and Aiden was on his way before he had finished explaining. The lab smelled of cheap disinfectant and coffee. Jake took one look at the vial and his mouth went thoughtful. "Where'd you get this?" he asked. "There's a lot I'd like to ask. Run whatever screens you have."
"No chain of custody stuff. Between us." Jake smiled, the crooked smile of a man who liked being trusted with a secret. "You're dodging double jeopardy, Doc. But okay, I'll run the basic assay. Nothing fancy." They worked in a corner of the lab that looked like a children's playroom for chemistry: glassware, a centrifuge that hummed like a small, contented animal. Jake's results were cautious at first, some peaks on a readout that suggested the presence of benzodiazepine-class compounds. Not a precise label, not a dose, but enough to say, sedative present. A low-dose sedative, the sort used to calm, to keep someone in a quiet state. It wouldn't kill on its own. It would keep someone under. It would make the difference between waking and remaining mute. Aiden felt the room tilt. He thought of Olivia in the glassed-off quiet, of the tight bandages, of the months of absence that no scan had adequately explained. He thought about the motives that make people cruel in their domestic places, the ways money contorts love. "Who else knows about this?" Jake asked, voice barely above the centrifuge's hum. "Just you and me," Aiden said. "For now." They both knew that the right thing to do was to involve security, pharmacy, and the hospital's legal counsel. They also knew how institutions could spin. Evidence could be shifted. Stories could be told. Aiden had spent enough nights in margins to know that whistleblowing had a shape, a long process, personal cost, a chance of being laughed out of the room. He felt the old tug of conscience and of fear. He wrote a note to himself on the back of a discarded order form: collect footage from room 12, review visitor logs, speak to Jenny. Jenny had been on rotation as Olivia's night nurse more than once. She was younger than Margaret, with tired eyes and the kind of voice that had learned to soften to family members in the small hours. When Aiden found her in the break room, she looked as if she'd aged 5 years overnight. "You're the one cutting the tape, right?" she asked without preamble, looking at his hands as if searching for a physical proof. "It was binding," he said. "You worried?" She pressed her palms flat on the table. "I didn't do anything," she said too quickly. "I wouldn't. God, I couldn't." "Did you see anyone administer anything?" Aiden asked. Jenny's eyes filled. It was impossible to tell if it was the room's fluorescent light or the memory of the moment that made them shine. "Sometimes they'd come in and check vitals. It was routine. But there were other times."
She rubbed the back of her neck, a motion that betrayed nerves rather than physical strain. Once I came in and a man left 2 vials at the foot of the bed. I assumed it was from EMS. They often left meds. It made sense. Did you see the man? Aiden asked. She swallowed. I saw a visitor leave with someone from the family. I don't know. I didn't want to get involved. I'm temporary, you know? I keep my shifts.
I need my job. Do you remember what the man looked like? Short hair, expensive coat, handled things like he had done it before. He didn't look like someone who would be in a waiting room. Jenny's confession was the kind of thing that could unravel into rumor. Aiden kept his voice low and concrete. Did you ever see the vials given by staff? A nurse? A doctor? No, she said. Never. But there were forms. Sometimes forms with signatures that didn't match the times. Aiden wrote it down. He felt the growing shape of a puzzle making itself visible. The constrictive bandages, the unlabeled vial, a visiting man, irregular forms. The direction pointed not at chance, but at design. He pulled visitor logs, cross-referenced sign-in sheets, and then asked security for a review of the cameras. Asking security was a legal and administrative step. It also sent a ripple through the hospital that could be heard in the careful pauses of staff. Margaret's eyebrows shot up when he told her. You're opening the can, Aiden, she said. You know what that means. I know what it probably means, he said. We have an obligation. Somewhere in the traction between obligation and courage, the narrative of his life tilted. He was not acting out of bravado. He was acting out of the knowledge that sometimes a single intervention, 2 snips of scissors, the decision to note a small infraction, could change the course of a life. He thought of the people who had been so busy saving the lives of strangers that they'd missed the slow stealing of someone they loved. He thought of Olivia's public face, and then of the person sleeping under medicated breath. The footage that security produced was grainy, the kind of black and white that belonged to the connective tissue of surveillance. Slightly out of time, with the occasional flicker. There was a timestamp, though, and that timestamp was enough. The camera outside Olivia's suite caught a figure entering with a quick professional motion. Fumbling with a jacket, a hand tucked into a pocket. He moved like someone who had rehearsed this action. A precise choreography. He stayed in the room for fewer than 10 minutes. The camera at the corridor's other end watched him leave, shoulders squared. A man who did not bother with small talk. He asked for a freeze. He adjusted the brightness. The man was well dressed, the camera's pixels suggesting a tailored coat and a watch. He reached into the bed area, paused as if adjusting something. The footage was not explicit. There was no camera on the bedside itself, but Aiden's stomach constricted like a fist. Do you know who that is? Jake asked, leaning over his shoulder. Aiden's face was blank. He watched, and then the image stuttered into a clearer frame as security adjusted replay speed. The man turned, and the profile was better. A sharp cheek, a jaw that held like a hawk. He placed something on the bedside table and left with a purposeful step.
A name crawled into Aiden's mind like light through a keyhole. Daniel Nyen. Daniel was Olivia's brother, the name that appeared too often in the filings that floated like a rumor through the hospital's visitors log, because he was a family member who managed the private affairs. Daniel was a presence who made people defer. He was also, in the court of public opinion, the man who benefited most from Olivia's absence. Aiden took a breath that felt as if it could break open in his chest. He thought about chain custody and due protocols. He thought about internal affairs and how important it was to have meetings documented. He also thought, naked and true, about how a person can look like business in a suit and still be the author of cruelty. He did not go to the press. He put the footage on a flash drive. He made copies. He put one copy in a manila folder in his locker, a physical anchor for a case that might otherwise dissolve into bureaucracy. He wrote down the times and circled them in red because the color made them feel real. He slept badly, feeling like someone who had peered through a keyhole and found a darker room on the other side. Olivia's first conscious moments arrived in small, ridiculous increments. A stray finger curl, a blink that lasted a beat longer than reflex.
Not one of those things that made sense as a surgery miracle. They were the slow, shy upwelling of a mind that had been present but unreachable. When she first regained awareness enough to react, it was as though she had been listening to a radio in another town and someone finally found the right frequency. Aiden sat by her bed and learned to read micro-gestures like a foreign script. He invented a code for yes and no, a blink for yes, a squeeze for no, because she could not speak, and the effort of trying would have exhausted her. He learned to place her hand between his palms and watch for the slight tightening of a muscle when she sought to tell him something. He watched the way her eyes tracked, slow at first, as though she were relearning depth. He was careful with language, with touch, with the small moves that make another person feel seen. "You came for me," she tried to mouth once, words thin as tissue. Aiden smiled, cautious, and answered, "I'm here." Her mind, when it finally reached him, was a field of scattered notes. She could describe a logo, fingers twitching to outline a familiar interface. She could recall a dinner last year where she laughed until she couldn't breathe. She could not at first recall the present's dangerous edges, the gap between before and after. She asked for cards, his deck of playing cards, and shuffled them with fingers that remembered routines, as if the small ritual were a way to stitch life back together. The cards were a hinge between the world she had left and the one she was re-entering. Aiden told her things she could not remember, that she had been in an accident, that she had been unconscious for months.
He told her about the bandages only when she asked with a fierce curiosity of someone who had just been betrayed by their own body. He let her look at the incision scars. He watched how it made her wince, how it also brought relief, as if the truth, once known, offered starting points for rebuilding. There were soft surprises. Olivia had been a private magnet with a public face, but under the headlines she kept a meticulous, oddly personal ledger of the world. Little lists of favorite teas, the layout of her childhood apartment, a photograph of a dog she had once cared for. When she tried to speak, it came out in slow, beautiful fragments, names, a sentence, then a gap. Her brain had things to reassemble. The good neurologist called it diascasis. To Aiden, up close, it looked like an orchestra finding its conductor. Each small success became a private celebration, a first sip of water managed, the clean sweep of a hand over a sheet without convulsions, the first full sentence that came after weeks of halting monosyllables. The code they used for yes and no matured into full conversation. She learned to write again, a clumsy marker idiosyncratic as handwriting. She discovered that small decisions could be hers: ask for a window open, choose the shirt she liked, refuse a visitor. Each decision reclaimed a corner of her autonomy. Once, when the afternoon light turned the room golden, she looked at him with the blunt directness of someone who had been forced to watch their life being administered by others. "Why did you cut the bandages?" she asked. He had rehearsed the answer like a speech. Instead, he shrugged and told her the truth, that the bandages had been too tight, that they could have been keeping her from breathing freely. He said it without accusation. He was not sure whether to say it with anger or algebra. "I thought it was the right thing," he finished. She considered him like a figure in a photograph, looking closer at the edges. "You could get in trouble," she said. "I already might have," he said. Her laughter was little and raveling. It was not a triumph so much as recognition. "You have a full sense of conscience," she said. "I like that." It was not flirtation. It was not even gratitude that would stake a claim to romance. It was the beginning of trust. She pronounced his name, tasted the syllables like a new language. There was a depth to her regard that made him feel seen in a way no one at the hospital had yet managed. Seen not just as a doctor, but as someone who had decided to stand where the risk was. When Aiden told her about the vial, he was careful with the details. He left out the footage at first. He spoke in proportionate truths. There are medications in medicine rooms that shouldn't be there. Sometimes things are misplaced. She tightened her jaw like someone bracing to be angry at being vulnerable. "Find out," she told him. "Find out and make it stop." That sentence, so ordinary, so active, was a pivot.
It was not the words of a victim, but of someone deciding to take back agency. They made plans slowly. He would gather evidence, she would rest and relearn speech. They were two people on a battlefield where the enemy might be family. The discovery of the unlabeled sedative was a logical lead, but the thread that followed led back to what hospitals have always been: human places full of messy allegiances. Aiden traced signatures on medication logs and found what looked like small discrepancies: initials that didn't match the nurse on duty, times that suggested the dosing had been logged after the fact. He asked for pharmacy reports and ran the list of who had access. The list read like a social map of the hospital. People with schedules and leases, people with bills to pay. But one name kept reappearing in a pattern that made his skin go cold. Daniel Nyen had visited multiple times, always in the comfortable hours when Olivia's care seemed to be a matter of business. Lawyers, financial advisors, people who crossed the boundary between personal and fiduciary. He showed the footage to Jake in a different light. Jake, who liked to think in data, paused the clip frame by frame. He pointed to a bare hand placing a small object on the bedside table. "It's not explicit," Jake said. "We can't say for sure it's the vial, but it's a pattern. Someone visits, something changes. Personnel shift." Aiden felt both the thrill and the drag of building a case. He had always liked the parts of medicine that were detective work, pattern recognition, synthesis, the slow thrill of connecting details into a coherent line. This was detective work gone moral. To accuse someone like Daniel Nyen, that meant a trial beyond the hospital's walls. It meant news cameras, legal counsel, the unmooring of privileged defenses. It also meant his name in emails and the possibility of a professional reprimand that could end his career. He thought of Olivia's face when she asked him not to let whatever had kept her asleep continue. He thought of Margaret's eyes when she had warned him of consequences. He thought of the small pair of scissors in the drawer, neat and unassuming, and he felt the gravity of the choice: to fold the evidence into neat, unthreatening forms and let the system hum, or to push, uncomfortably and possibly alone, on a hunk of machinery that had a lot to protect. He chose to push. Aiden sent a carefully worded email to Dr. Khan in Internal Affairs and attached the footage, the lab result, and Jenny's note. He wrote in a style he hoped the hospital could not easily spin into negligence. He asked for an independent review. He copied Jake. He BCC'd his own account to the manila folder in his locker, and then, because people who have done the risky thing often need a human witness, he called Rachel Kim.
Rachel was not a hospital counsel. She was a friend of a friend, a lawyer who had made a name for herself in civil rights work and who had a taste for cases where the systems had failed. Aiden had known her for months in a professional but slightly distant way. Her office had donated pro bono hours to a clinic he had worked with. She had once given a lecture at the hospital about patients' rights. When he explained the pattern, without adjectives and without accusation, her voice went sharpened into focus. "Preserve everything," she told him. "Chain of custody is the backbone of this. Get copies. Do not hand over original evidence to anyone until you have counsel present, and document absolutely everything." He was relieved to have someone speak in the firm, procedural language that could form the skeleton of accountability. For the first time since cutting the tape, the weight of prosecution felt less like personal risk and more like an opening for justice. That evening, when the corridor lights dimmed and Olivia slept a fitful little sleep of someone relearning dreams, Aiden sat at her bedside and arranged the deck of cards between them. She smiled in her sleep and turned half, as if to tuck something away. He placed his hand lightly over hers and felt a small pulse of warmth, like a child's secret. He did not know what Daniel Nyen planned. He did not know whether the footage, the vial analysis, and a shaken nurse's testimony would be enough to persuade anyone outside their quiet room. He only knew the moral axis of the matter. Someone had chosen to keep Olivia under. Someone had profited in the silence. The next morning, security came back with another clip, different angle, different time. A man in a tailored coat had not only visited but had been seen talking with someone who looked like a hospital staff member at the nurse's station. The camera showed hands close, whispering, an exchange so quick it could have been folded into any number of explanations. The man left with his coat pulled tight enough to be a shield. Aiden stood in the footage and felt the columns of possibility rearrange. He was on a precipice. The world on the other side might be a courtroom of lights and cameras and cross-examinations, or it might be a quiet reconciliation where the hospital admitted error and fixed it. He thought of the cost to Olivia. She had been silent for months, and the world might now ask her to speak for herself under the harsh sun. He closed his laptop and slid the manila folder into his locker. The familiar click of the lock was oddly reassuring. He walked back to the ICU and found Olivia awake, eyes bright and a little fierce. When she recognized him, something like relief uncoiled across her face. "They're coming for their answers," she said. "We're going to get them," he replied. His voice had the brittle steadiness of someone who had committed himself to a hard thing. He could not yet see the end of it.
He could only see the next step: accumulation of proof, legal counsel, the cautious rebuilding of a woman's voice. Outside, the city had found its rhythm. Rain had given way to a clearing sky. The hospital lights buzzed like an unending promise.
In Aiden's pocket, his phone buzzed with a message from Jake. Preliminary confirmation on metabolites consistent with sedative use. The word didn't make the moral shape of the thing. It only added weight to what he had cut open with a pair of small scissors. In the corridor, Margaret watched him approach. Her eyes held a different expression now, less the steely administrator and more the woman who had learned to nurse her misgivings like an ache. "Be careful," she said without the previous officiousness. "If you're going to open this, make sure you can handle what comes after." "I know," he said. He thought of the manila folder and the deck of cards, of Olivia's tiny, fierce gestures of reclaiming language. He thought of the hospital as a place where things were both mended and broken, often by the same hands. He thought of small acts and of the way they ripple outward. "Good," she said, "because sometimes the institution is the better choice for safety. Sometimes it isn't. Make sure you have both, evidence and people." He pocketed his phone, felt its weight like a held secret, and returned to the room. Inside, Olivia had reached for a card and was running the edges of it between two fingers with focus. She looked up and met his eyes as if they had made an unspoken pact. "We find out who did it," she said, each word slow and deliberate. "We show them the lights." Aiden nodded. He had not yet told her everything he had seen. He would not put her at the center of crossfire. But there was agency in her demand, and agency was part of the cure. For the first time since he had cut the bandages, he felt less like a man guessing at right action, and more like someone whose small intervention had become the hinge of a larger movement. The footage, the vial, the shaky testimonies, they were pieces. There was a story to be told now, one that threaded through private rooms and executive offices, through the cheap light of surveillance and the expensive camouflage of a tailored coat. Somewhere between the manila folder and the courthouse, where the law and the cameras would test the weight of David against Goliath, Aiden felt the gravity of his choice bloom into something that would either vindicate or consume them. He did not yet know how violent the pushback might be, or how far Daniel Nyen would go to keep his world intact. He only knew that a small act, the cupping of a pair of scissors under tape, had unlatched a door, and that beyond that door would be more danger than he had first imagined. He also knew that if he stepped back now, Olivia's life might fold again into silence.
He placed the deck of cards on the bedside table and let the thin plastic box sit beside the manila folder in his locker like twin talismans, one for the ordinary comforts of breath and luck, the other for the stubborn, dull, legal resistance that justice asks of those willing to step forward. Then he made a decision that felt at once reckless and inevitable. He would not wait for the hospital to move. He would gather more, quietly and legally, and he would get Olivia the voice she needed. The first real thread of the story had been pulled. There would be witnesses to find, a lawyer to recruit, public scrutiny to endure. There were risks to career and to personal safety. But Aiden's hands, still smelling faintly of antiseptic and tape, had done their small, human work. The room felt like the inside of a watch, tight, precise, full of tiny moving parts that, if one misaligned, could stop the whole. He sat in the chair beside the bed and watched Olivia close her eyes with the exhaustion of slow recovery. He thought of the night he'd cut the bandage and the spike on the monitor that had told him, in a blunt way, that he had been right to act. The ripple had become a current. The current had a direction, out of the dim silence of a coma and into the bright, risky, sunlit places where people are made to answer for what they do. He folded his hands in his lap and, for the first time, let himself imagine the courtroom, a windowless room, the hum of lights, a jury whose faces were a stranger mosaic. He imagined Olivia standing under the bright scrutiny, able to declare, with a voice that was now accorded to her, what had been done to her. He imagined Daniel in the dock and the slippage of his public composure. He imagined the neck-deep, ugly process that often accompanies findings of abuse in places where power cloaks itself. None of those images were certain. All of them, he felt in his bones, were possible now that a doctor had seen what others had not. Outside, the city moved on, taxis hissed, a dog barked, a woman with an umbrella hurried past the hospital's entrance. Inside, Olivia's breath measured the small comeback of muscle and memory. Aiden took the manila folder from his locker, checked the footage again, and slid the vial, a small, unlabeled cylinder that had become the catalyst of everything, into a sealed evidence bag. He thought of it in his hands as an artifact of a decision. He felt the peculiar quiet of someone who had done the right thing
and knew, with the slow certainty of a man who had glanced over the precipice and not leapt, that the work had only begun. If stories where a single careful act changes everything speak to you, subscribe for more. There are more like this, where small courage meets a big consequence. Aiden walked into work the Monday after he'd sealed the vial in an evidence bag and felt the hospital like a place that had shifted under his feet.
The usual odor of antiseptic and laundry was tinged now with a watchful quality. People met his eyes and looked away, or leaned in and asked questions he wasn't ready to answer. Internal Affairs had acknowledged receipt of his email. Security had more footage queued for review. His inbox had a short formal invitation, an administrative meeting with Dr. Khan and the hospital legal officer. The invitation read like a polite guillotine. He had expected the institutional machinery to grind, to ask for patience, to offer the language of process as a balm. He had not misread the risk. At the meeting, Dr. Khan spoke in bullet points and legalisms. Protocol must be followed, chain of custody, potential disciplinary action. Aiden listened, hands folded on his knees like someone trying to be as small as possible. He told the truth plainly, why he had cut the bandage, what he'd found, what he had preserved. He showed them the manila folder. He let them see the footage, the lab readouts that Jake had run, Rachel's initial legal notes. He did not revel in accusation. He simply set things down as facts. "We will open an investigation," Dr. Khan said, "but you must understand you took actions outside of standard procedure. That will be noted." Margaret, sitting to the side with her habitual straight-backed posture, surprised him by speaking up in a tone that was almost gentle. "I warned you," she said, "but there was no triumph in it. You documented, you brought it forward. There is a difference between negligence and conscience." The hospital placed him on administrative leave pending the outcome of the internal review, a standard step, Dr. Khan said, to ensure impartiality. It was not a punishment, it was a protective measure. The protective measure felt to Aiden like a small exile. It was inconvenient, it was humiliating, and it was, he knew, the cost of pushing on a closed thing. He left the room with the folder in his arms and the deck of cards shoved into his coat pocket like an anchor. Rachel moved faster than he could have expected. She filed a referral to the county prosecutor, set up chain of custody protocols with an independent laboratory, and began the kind of paperwork that makes justice audible: subpoenas, affidavits, witness statements. She told him plainly that the hospital's own review would be a parallel process, but that the criminal case could proceed if the evidence met threshold. She kept him focused on the practical: copies, custody logs, who had keys, where the vial had originated. She also told him, in a voice that held the ferocity of someone who had long since learned what it took to hold institutions accountable, that he was not a hero, he was a witness who had stepped into danger. Olivia's recovery continued in increments measured by new thermometers, each small amelioration a proof against the inertia she had been living under. She underwent a capacity evaluation by an independent neuropsychologist, not because anyone doubted her spirit, but because a court would need an assessment that established she understood the nature of the proceedings and could answer for herself. The evaluation was clinical and kindly. The doctor asked her simple questions about dates, about people in her life, about her understanding of what had happened. Olivia answered with a mix of bluntness and delicacy. She knew the difference between being cared for and being dominated. When the evaluation concluded she was of sound mind to make medical and legal decisions, she signed the forms with a pen that shook just enough to make it scrawl human. That signature changed everything. It meant she could testify. It meant she could fire Daniel from any fiduciary authority he claimed. It meant she could speak in a courtroom and tell a jury, under oath, what she remembered and what had been taken from her. It also meant that she could, on her own, decide what consent looked like when the world wanted to assign her a victimhood that had no room for agency. Their private moments together grew into a rhythm unmarked by medical necessity. Recovery provided the scaffolding: therapy sessions, speech drills, the slow choreographies of regaining strength. Outside of those rooms, they started to share coffee in a hospital cafeteria, sitting across from each other over chipped mugs while the flow of cafeteria trays and fluorescent light went on. The first time she asked him to meet her at a park bench for an hour, it registered as an extraordinary, ordinary request. "I want to taste the air that isn't filtered," she said. And when they sat on the bench, she watched a dog that chased a toss of a ball and laughed, startling herself with the sound. It was the sound of someone who had not been asked to perform for months and found out she still liked it. Their companionship never skipped the safeguards.
After the capacity evaluation, Olivia asked for time alone to consider what she wanted publicly and privately. She consulted Rachel about the optics of dating a physician who had cared for her. Rachel advised patience and clear documentation of competency and independent consent. Olivia asked for another evaluation for her own peace, a cognitive follow-up, a statement she could present if the tabloids tried to frame her actions as naive. Olivia insisted that everything be above board. When they finally crossed that threshold, an evening where they ate pizza on paper plates in Aiden's small kitchen and shared stories about the strangest interviews they'd ever had, the first kiss was an agreement between two whole people, not a rescue. Aiden watched Olivia consider that small human act, and then she closed the distance with a steady hand and a smile that said plainly, "I choose this." The moment was quiet and careful. It was, they both agreed later, how it should have been from the start.
Meanwhile, the legal world ticked forward like a pendulum. Rachel had built a mosaic of evidence. Jake's independent lab confirming the presence of a sedative consistent with benzodiazepine-class metabolites, the security footage showing Daniel's presence in Olivia's room, Jenny's recorded statement about vials left at bedside, and financial records, changes in power of attorney, transfers to accounts that suggested unauthorized consolidation of control during Olivia's incapacitation. Rachel prepared witness lists, coordinated with county prosecutors, and arranged for expert testimony about the typical effects of sustained sedatives on consciousness, always careful to avoid clinical overreach while providing the jury with a frame for understanding the harm. The defense strategy was predictably blunt: cast doubt on the evidence chain, highlight hospital protocol breaches, including Aiden's bandage cutting, and paint the narrative of a wealthy family in crisis. They tried to show that visitation was common and that medication might have been administered legitimately by EMS on arrival. Daniel, appearing calm and composed at first, denied wrongdoing in terse, charismatic statements. He suggested that the hospital spotlight was a media hunger that had to be fed. The courtroom scenes had an intensity that made Aiden feel like a small animal under a bright lamp. The prosecutor methodically laid out the timeline. Olivia goes into a coma. Visits occur. Medication records show discrepancies. Independent lab finds sedative. Security footage shows Daniel visiting and placing something on the bedside. Jenny testifies about unusual vials. Bank records show suspicious transfers. Rachel's cross-examination of a hospital administrator revealed a pattern of lax oversight in some corners and a culture of deference to wealthy families that made the jury sit up straighter. Olivia's testimony was the pivot. The first days leading up to it were a study in quiet resolve. She rehearsed with Rachel, going over how to answer tight, precise questions without letting the defense turn her pain into pageantry. When she walked past the packed gallery and took her oath, the room seemed to inhale. She spoke carefully about the day she remembered, about the presence of a man in an expensive coat, about waking and feeling drowsy in a way that didn't match the kind of post-accident sedation she had expected. She told the court that she remembered a man leaning in, a hand offering something that tasted like an antiseptic cloud in her lungs, and that when she later reviewed footage, she recognized the profile. The defense tried to undermine her memory with questions about her condition during those months. She answered with the blunt clarity of someone who had recovered the ability to speak for herself. She remembered enough to know something wrong had been done. Jake testified about the lab work.
He explained his methods with cautious, plain language. Samples were tested, peaks on chromographs were consistent with sedative compounds, and the results were rerun by an outside lab to confirm. Jenny took the stand, and hands trembling, described the nights she had nervously shifted in her seat, seeing things that didn't quite make sense, but feeling too afraid to interrupt. Her voice broke in the telling. She apologized for the delay in speaking up, saying she had been scared for her job. The prosecutor treated her with the respect of someone who had finally stepped out of silence. Daniel's defense lawyer tried to sew in reasonable doubt at every seam. They argued that the footage was grainy and that hospital staff could have made errors in paperwork without malicious intent. They highlighted Aiden's prior breach of protocol, cutting the bandage, to suggest he was a disgruntled, fearful clinician looking for meaning. The attempt to smear Aiden's motives stung. Aiden sat in the gallery and listened as his actions were reframed as personal crusade. Rachel handled the cross with steadiness, reframing his bandage cutting as an ethically motivated intervention that was documented and reported, and forcing the defense to account for why a wealthy sibling would profit from prolonged incapacity. Deliberations lasted several days. Aiden found those hours unbearable, time stretched by the need to stay composed in public, while his personal life unfurled in the most naked of ways. Rachel texted him small updates that read like little lifelines. We did well today. Jury deliberating. Hold tight. Olivia, when she emerged from a conference with her counsel, walked to his side and took his hand as if it were a tangible proof of the life they were both choosing. When the jury returned, the judge's gavel seemed to take a physical portion of air out of the room. Guilty on counts of administering a substance with intent to cause grievous bodily harm. Guilty on fraud charges related to unauthorized financial transfers. Daniel's face gave no dramatic twitches. He sat like someone who had rehearsed stoicism. The verdict came with a sense of coral-thin relief, sharp and not entirely clean. Justice had been found in a court, but the rest of the world had its own processes. The celebrations were short-lived. Outside the courthouse, as the press corps gathered and cameras tilted toward the familiar faces of scandal and vindication, danger found a way in. The world had been loud with verdicts and with the odor of triumph. The judgment day had been scheduled and performed. And then the pavement outside the courthouse inaugurated the next scene. A man lunged from the crowd, moving too fast to be a spontaneous act. He was not nearly as coordinated as a professional had to be, and yet he had a single-mindedness that suggested payment. Aiden saw him out of the corner of his eye and moved like a magnet.
He shoved Olivia behind his shoulder, turning his body toward the man in a motion that was part reflex and part something deeper. The first impact tore a red seam in his forearm as the attacker swung a metal object meant to wound. Security descended, a flurry of hands and shields. The assailant was wrestled into the stone and driven down like a small, enraged animal. Aiden was bleeding. The wound was not fatal, but it bled and stung and left his shirt patterned with the bright color of a body's betrayal. Olivia screamed once, an animal sound of shock and gratitude, then fell into his arms as the paramedics checked them both. The attacker, in the triage later, shouted something about protecting family and names that had to be parsed and validated. Security's quick work and the courthouse cameras captured his lunge on tape. The footage would later connect him to a handler with ties to Daniel's world. It was another rack of evidence added to an already complicated case. The hospital pressed him into a bed for stitches and observation. He laughed once in the tiny ward at the absurdity of being wounded for doing what any human would have done, protect someone in their care. Olivia sat beside him, clutching his hand in a fierce, public way. Reporters wanted a line, cameras wanted a headline. The tabloids, already salivating for the romance angle, cranked out stories that questioned the propriety of a doctor dating his former patient. The insinuation stung, not because the relationship was wrong. Olivia's capacity and consent were documented and shared with counsel, but because shame harnesses people better than facts sometimes. Aiden retreated into the quiet of the hospital's small visitors' garden with a bandage on his arm and an ache in his chest that had nothing to do with the wound. He had done what he believed had to be done. He had paid a cost. The tabloids made that cost look like moral compromise. He wrestled with insecurity, the same old voice that asked whether he was enough, whether the world would always fit him into a heroic box he hadn't asked to occupy. Olivia found him there, rain-wet grass soft beneath her shoes. She sat without ceremony and took his hand in both of hers. She had been on television earlier, answering questions with a poised bluntness that had surprised many who watched. She had refused to be spun into a victim and instead framed the story as one of accountability, not revenge. "You look at how they want to make you smaller," she said. "Don't let them shrink you to what they need you to be." "They'll keep trying," he said. She nodded. "Then we'll keep trying louder." She smiled at him, that fierce smile that opened like a hand. "And if people ask a hard question about us, I'll answer it. For myself, for you. There is nothing to hide." Her words were public, but they were also private. She made a deliberate decision then and there. She would not let anonymous whispering decide her life.
There would be open statements, files posted for transparency, and above all, she would say on the record that she had chosen him. When the tabloids tried to turn their story into a melodrama, Olivia held a press conference and chose her words with surgeon-like care. She thanked the medical team, named Jake and Jenny for their courage, and looked directly at the cameras when she said, "Dr. Aiden Lee did what any caring physician would have done. I am grateful. I also want to be clear. The relationship between Dr. Lee and me is consensual, mature, and entered into with full capacity. We are building something together." The simplicity of that statement unmoored some narratives. It did not stop the gossip, but it stopped a great many insinuations. For Aiden, the public affirmation was a hinge, proof that the woman who had regained her voice wanted him in her life for reasons that were hers, not the world's. Daniel's sentencing followed. He would face years behind bars.
restitution orders, and professional humiliation as courts unspooled the damages done to his sister's autonomy and finances. The attackers who had lunged were connected through cell phone records to a chain that traced back to a shell company with loose ties to him. The law moved the way law does, deliberate, sometimes forgetful of the human toll, but in this case, ultimately rigorous enough to convict. Life soothed and then reassembled in new ways. Olivia began to take the reins of her legacy with a sudden and deliberate generosity that startled those who had known her as ruthlessly acquisitive. She dissolved a portion of her holdings into a trust dedicated to healthcare access. She partnered with Rachel and other advisors to found a clinic in a neighborhood several subway stops from St. Augustine, a place where care would be community-rooted, where the sting of bureaucracy would be replaced with help and tenderness. They called it the Aiden Lee Community Clinic, a name that felt honest to both their histories. Opening a clinic was less cinematic than they had imagined. There were zoning meetings, grant applications, staffing interviews. They argued about whether to hang both of their names on the sign. Margaret donated a photograph from the hospital's archives. Jake agreed to consult on lab protocols. They hired a modest staff that included nurses who had seen the worst and wanted to see a different way of being in the world. Aiden returned to practice after the hospital's review closed with a formal acknowledgement that, while he had acted outside written protocol, his documentation and speed in reporting had been critical to protecting a patient's well-being. The administrative leave ended with a letter that praised his ethical impulse, but reminded him of the need for institutional process. He accepted the admonition with a humbled grace. He had paid the price in a way that reshaped how he would practice going forward.
Their relationship moved with the slow, steady gravity of two adults who had passed through fire. They had the awkward publicness of new lovers in the era of cameras, but they also had private rituals: Sunday morning coffee on the clinic stoop, shared playlists for the staff room, and a deck of cards that Olivia kept in her office as a talisman, a reminder that ordinary comforts are not small things. The manila folder that had once lived in Aiden's locker was now archived properly with the county's evidence vault, the booklet finally sealed in the courthouse with receipts and witness lists. It was a quiet end to what had started as a secret. They married in an afternoon that unfolded like a private vow stitched into public consequence. The ceremony was small. Margaret stood with a shawl over her shoulders. Rachel read a short prose about agency and justice, and Jake tried to keep his voice steady as he led a toast. Olivia's parents, once estranged in the aftermath, were there too, making small apologies that landed like new tiling in an old house. Their vows were not dramatic flair. They were promises rooted in the lessons they'd learned. Olivia promised to continue to honor the autonomy she had reclaimed in the work she would do. Aiden promised to keep his oath: first to care, second to listen, third to respect boundaries even when conscience tugged. They did not frame the marriage as the coronation of a savior. They framed it as the beginning of a partnership. Opening day at the Nyen Lee Community Clinic felt, in an unassuming way, like the proper ending to the long arc that had started with 2 scissors and a too-tight bandage. The clinic sign was a modest brass plaque. Inside the waiting room there were chairs with worn upholstery, a coffee urn that someone had donated, and a small shelf of paperbacks. A video loop played on a tablet in the corner explaining patient rights. Olivia gave a short speech about the importance of listening, about how the clinic would prioritize consent, dignity, and access over flashy services. Aiden stood to the side and watched the people file in: young mothers with toddlers, a man with arthritic hands, someone who had a long list of old grievances and a shorter list of trust. The work was steady, sometimes tedious, and entirely worth it. There were moments of small grace in the clinic's first weeks. A teenage boy came in with a scraped knee and left with a bandage and a story that made the nurses laugh. A woman who had been terrified of hospitals for decades sat in a chair, while Aiden explained in plain language what a vaccine did and why it was safe. They repurposed one of the clinic rooms as a small community meeting space. Olivia funded a series of workshops about financial literacy and consent, things that had felt impossibly abstract until they'd been turned into concrete help.
Months after the trial, on a quiet evening when the clinic's lights dimmed and the sound of the city softened into a distant pulse, Aiden and Olivia stood on the clinic's small front porch. The day's last patient had left with a prescription and a cautious smile. They sat on the wood steps and let the sun, low and forgiving, make the clinic sign a warm rectangle of gold. A deck of cards lay on the table beside them, the edges frayed from use. Olivia reached across and took his hand, the calluses on his fingers a map of small labors. The manila folder, no longer a living object of secret, sat in a box in the back office, properly labeled and stored. It stayed there as a reminder of what had been required for justice to run its slow course. "We were lucky," Olivia said, and her words had the weight of truth rather than the lightness of cliché. Lucky to have someone notice, luckier to have someone act. Aiden smiled, thinking of how brittle the term hero sounded sometimes.
"It was more than luck," he said. "Someone saw what others didn't. But luck played a part. People have to be ready to act." She turned her face toward him and let the last light soften the lines of the day. "We turn something ugly into something that works," she said. "That's not just luck. It's choice."
Later, when the world was quiet and the lights in the clinic were off, the two of them sat on the couch in the small apartment they shared. Aiden's forearm bore the thin, pale line of a scar from that day outside the courthouse, a modest evidence of something that had been done for another. Olivia set the deck of cards on the coffee table, shuffled as if life's little rituals could be made to feel forever. They did not need grand metaphors. They needed closeness, coffee, the plan for the clinic's next outreach program, and each other. The story that had begun with a single, noticing glance, the kind of glance many people might have dismissed, had moved through fear, legal rigor, embarrassment, wound, and finally a rebuilding that served more than two people. It ended not in a tidy moral, but in a practiced, daily generosity. The Nyen Lee Clinic served its first 100 patients. Aiden resumed rounds with the humility of someone who remembers the cost of action. Olivia walked through the clinic doors each morning like someone reclaiming an ordinary day. If this story touched you, subscribe and see more stories about people who notice, who act, and who, imperfectly, change the trajectory of someone else's life.